Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Small Town Tourist Podcast, where we experience and explore everything that makes small towns great. I'm your host, Abby, and I'm going to keep this intro short and sweet because I have one of the longest podcast episodes I've ever done for you today. We are talking with one of my previous bosses and one of my great friends. We are hanging out with Chad Taylor today, radio personality, and he actually has a very interesting story of managing so many incredible people, from Jordan Knight to Danny Wood to Jeff Timmons. Like, he has such an incredible story of working in the music industry. So I just want to give Chad that platform and that time. So thank you so much for tuning in, and please enjoy hanging out with Chad Taylor.
So come on home, claim your throne when life gets you down. It's nice to know there's somewhere to go where folks care about you. We can't give you the world, but we'll give you a crown. 'Cause you're the queen of our hometown.
Okay, let's get this bad boy started. So I always start with having the guest tell me their name, where they're from, and what you do. So feel free to tell me any type of town that you're from, because I know you got a laundry list of stops along the way.
You got it. Well, this is Chad Zimmerman, but most people know me as Chad Taylor. I was born and raised in Racine, Wisconsin, which is just outside Milwaukee, but my career has kind of taken me all across the country, from Wisconsin to Illinois to Florida, Minnesota, and now Iowa.
That's how I know you, is from your stint of time in Minnesota. Chad was the person who hired me to work at Mix 94.9, for which I am eternally grateful, because there were so many wonderful opportunities that came from that. And what's really interesting, I didn't know this when you hired me, but you have a vibrant past of working with so many incredible musicians.
I do. You know, a lot of people don't know this. I don't talk about this a lot, but how that started really was when I was a teenager. I mean, really young. We're talking 8th grade. I started writing songs, and I was really into hip hop. I loved like 80s, early 90s hip hop. I loved Beastie Boys, Run DMC, Public Enemy, LL Cool J. And so I might have been the pre-Vanilla Ice, if you will. I was writing hip hop songs. And my parents actually, again, I've never talked about this. They actually funded my first album. I wrote an album and recorded it in the Quad Cities, which is the Quad Cities, for those that don't know, is like Moline, Illinois, Rock Island, Illinois, and then they combine with 2 cities in Iowa, Bettendorf and Davenport, and they're connected by the bridge at the Mississippi River. So I recorded at a studio called Cana Recording, and that's how I started. I just always knew what I wanted to do. I wasn't one of those kids that went through, I want to be a cop, I want to be a fireman, I want to be this, I want to be that. I always knew I wanted to be in the entertainment business, in the music business, but I really wanted to be a recording artist first.
How did that initial album experience go for you? Being from Racine, how did you know what to do? This is pre-Google, by the way, so.
Everything. You know, when they say people study, I studied those artists I talked about earlier. I was so passionate, and I threw myself in. I had a music teacher named Mrs. Constable, and I went to Catholic school, in a very small Catholic school. But she saw something in me, and as you can imagine, you know me well, Abby, I was a class clown in school. Sometimes I didn't take my schoolwork seriously. Sometimes I would cut it up in class. But she saw something in me, you know, and she really encouraged me. I mean, she saw what I wanted to do, and she was always that person behind me saying, you can do it. You just got to go for it. You got to, start somewhere. She used to always say, you got to start somewhere. And that's what I did. So my dad got transferred my sophomore year to the Quad Cities. And so when I got there, I didn't have a lot of friends. So I just immersed myself in the music and started writing. I started researching where to find recording studios. And again, I'd never been in a recording studio. And I met this guy named Skip Clarquist. I don't even know if he's alive anymore. And he ran a studio called Cana Recording in the Quad Cities. And, I just showed up one day and I told him what I wanted to do. And he put together a budget for me, and my parents funded it. And I put together an entire album. I wrote the album. I co-produced it. I did the artwork for it. And I actually got the record in all the stores in the Quad Cities at the time. It was interesting. And then I started getting calls from area promoters, and they were having me open up shows. And again, you got to remember, this was a time there wasn't a Vanilla Ice. There really wasn't, besides the Beastie Boys or Third Base, there really wasn't a white rap artist. So here I was opening up for bands at the time that were up and comers like Digital Underground, who Tupac was a dancer for at the time. And I was opening up for Ice Cube and all these different hip hop bands, Candyman. being this young white kid at the time, I just turned 16, I think, at the time I was doing those shows. And man, I'll tell you what, I got an education fast. But the cool thing about that is I started to make a name for myself. Of course, you get on that stage, they'd see my face and, they wanted to boo right away. But I think 2 or 3 songs in, they saw that I took it seriously. I was, honing my craft, and I loved hip hop. I think they could tell, and they could tell that I was legit. And I mean, doing that, it opened up a ton of doors because my dad started to get transferred all around, and that moved me to Lexington, Kentucky, and I continued to record down there. And the shows got bigger. I started opening up for bands like, I don't know if you would know it, you might be too young, but Daz FX was another hip hop duo, and TLC at the time, which they were starting to become big. I got to open up for them. And that's when I met the guys from the New Kids on the Block when I was really young. We first crossed paths in my teen years, and I kept those relationships. And, it's a crazy story of how I was first a recording artist. And I thought, man, I really thought I was going to make it big. I started to get, calls from record labels, and I started to release music, not only here in the States, but I was releasing stuff over in Europe. And at the time, I'm doing this music, and, you're a typical teenager. You're not listening to your parents. I met this girl, and she got pregnant. And of course, that started to derail my process, because then I wasn't just responsible for myself. I was responsible now for this family at a very young age. I was a very young dad. I was getting ready to turn 19. I just graduated high school. I moved back to Wisconsin. My whole family did. And I thought, I still got to continue with my passions. I started to DJ in a nightclub Wednesday through Saturday night from like 9 to 2 in the morning, Wednesday through Saturday. And then I would work full time during the day. And I still was writing and recording and performing, just working really hard at it. And how I got into radio, the funny thing is, a program director was one of my regulars at this nightclub. And I created a name as this guy people would come to go dance. I mean, we would have lines lined up to come to this club I was DJing at called Vintage Rock Cafe. And a guy named John Patrick is the one that brought me into radio. One night after a set, he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about radio?" And I'm like, "Of course, I love radio." But again, my mind was, I'm an entertainer, I'm a singer, I'm a rapper,
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Well, just come on down. Well, as you know, Abby, in this business, he's like, come on down. You can tech, you can board op." And this was back in the day when it wasn't like you just, you bring a Marty and you're good to go. This was craziness. And then I was thrust in pretty darn quick. I mean, from there, it was literally, I think a week later, they had fired their afternoon DJ and production director. And it was like trial by fire.
Isn't it so funny how that happens?
Crazy. And I was doing this balancing act of trying to figure out what a production director is. And you got to remember, this is back in like the mid 90s now. We're talking like 94, 95 at this point. They had like a 2-track reel to reel. I was producing stuff on a 2-track and trying to be on the air. And again, DJing in the club, trying to be a dad, trying to be a husband, and still not letting go of that dream of being a recording artist. I mean, it was craziness. There were times I was getting maybe 3 to 4 hours sleep tops at that time in my life.
And you were still functioning and still doing everything you could in your power to keep the family afloat, keep your dreams afloat. It's just incredible what the body is capable of when you're pushed into a corner.
Well, I tell my kids, I tell anybody that will listen, though, I look at those times and they were the best of times and the worst of times. And when I say that, they were the best of times professionally. I mean, I was really just, I was making some pretty good money at the time. I was kind of balancing and living in all these different worlds. I was, this nightclub DJ that people were coming to see. I was now starting to make a name for myself on a radio station, but it was an adult contemporary station, very AC. I mean, we're talking Hootie and the Blowfish and Elton John and Mariah Carey, very AC, So for a young guy at the time, it really wasn't the music that I wanted to be on the air with. But, again, it was something that really, I think, it sparked something in me, because at that point I realized, what, I don't know if this other plan is going to take off and work. And I was getting a little bit older. I know I'm saying that when I'm saying my, 1920 is getting older, but I was getting older. And again, I had a family to support. So I wanted to make sure I had that steady paycheck coming in, and that in radio and the club provided that. But, there was a cost to that too, because at the same time, you're young, you're trying to figure out life. I didn't even know what it was like, or how a husband was supposed to behave, or how a dad, I had my stepdad, was such a great example, but I was so young and had so much I wanted to do. And it was rough. It really was rough. I recall a time I was telling my oldest daughter, I recall a time, because you don't really budget that well. I remember a time that I was like digging in my pocket to go feed myself. There was a gas station on the corner from our apartment that I had. And at the time, I wasn't budgeting right. And I thought, got to make sure the electric bills are paid and the gas bill and the rent and all that. There was a Taco Bell inside of a gas station. And at the time, we were like scrounging for change. My wife at the time and I, just to be able to have Taco Bell, because we made sure the kids were eating. But, we didn't want to tell our parents. Could you imagine? I mean, our parents would have flown over and, stocked us up with groceries. But I just wanted to do it on my own. But I was so hyper focused on my career, and I was young, and I just took on so much at that time.
Yeah, things got to get sacrificed, and you're putting the kids first, and
oh man,
you just do what you got to do. I feel like every parent has that moment. It doesn't matter what your income is, it doesn't matter what your job status is. They have that moment where like, kid comes first. I am sitting on the back burner, and that's okay.
Though, I'll tell you what, even through every hardship I've had, every hardship has been a great learning experience for me. Everybody always asks me, my God, when your dad started transferring around in high school, that must have been difficult, and I thought it really wasn't for me, because me, I make friends pretty fast and easily. But if he hadn't taken those jobs, for example, if he hadn't taken that job in the Quad Cities, I would have never recorded my first album. If he hadn't taken the job in Lexington, I would have never met Brian Littrell from the Backstreet Boys. We went to school together at Tates Creek High School.
No way.
Yeah, I would have never met Brian. I would have never started that relationship. I would have never recorded what I still to this day think was my best work. I would have never opened up for TLC and Daz Effects and artists and bands like that. Again, because that opportunity led to that opportunity. And then going back to Racine, got me into radio. Everything happens for a reason. Even my failed first marriage, everything happened for a reason. It really did lead to better things for both of us. And, even a better life for my older kids, when I look at it now as a 47-year-old,
Yeah. Hindsight's 2020.
It is. You sat, and this well too, Abby. I know we have a big age difference, but how much we were talking about this off the podcast, just how much you sacrificed. And you're a hard worker. I tell you that all the time. I'm so, so proud of you and what you've accomplished at a young age. You remind me so much of myself. You will work literally till you drop. And you do that now. You put your all into everything that you do. And there's a sacrifice that comes with that. And I'm sure Corey feels that sacrifice, or felt it, especially when you were in radio. It's inevitable with the path that we chose, something has to give. And unfortunately, the give is sometimes the family life,
Yeah, it's the free time on the weekends. And I just recently jumped ship from radio to working for the local county, and I was having a really hard time with it. I'm 2 months into a new job, and I'm still having a hard time with it. But my sister was really great about putting into perspective. She said, think about this coming summer. Instead of spending your Saturday morning at some random Fleet Farm, you're going to get to be at the lake, which is what you want to do. And I'm like, thank you for keeping me level.
I'm convinced, because you have such a great job now, but I'm convinced at some point, because I love that you're doing this podcast, you're too talented not to do this. But I feel at some point too, you'll do something. You'll do something else on top of that job. I feel that.
I've already been putting feelers out.
I just know it. It's just, it's how we're built.
It is. Yeah. So let's get into post you getting into radio. Let's talk more of your management side of things, because you've helped out with countless artists on the road, traveling places, touring. How did you get into doing that?
So I was in Florida at the time. I was working for a radio station. It was called Citrus 95.3. It was just outside Tampa, Florida. And I mentioned earlier that I met the New Kids when I was a teenager, but we kind of lost touch. And then fast forward to, the late 90s. Both Jordan Knight and Joey McIntyre from New Kids finally released solo records, and were both touring again, visiting radio again, putting themselves out there again. And so I rekindled my relationship with first Danny Wood from New Kids, and then Jordan. So Danny was also working on a solo album, but quietly, where Jordan and Joey were like on TRL at the time, and Jordan was opening up for NSYNC on tour, and Joey had a top 10 record. Danny was quietly recording, and he first started recording under the name Defuse. He didn't want any association with his New Kids days at the time. He was doing like electronica, hip hop, it was very different from the New Kids. And then he decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to my singer-songwriter roots, and he put together this phenomenal album called Second Face. And I want to say this was around 2002. And he put this record out with a company, a small label in Miami. And at the time, they had reached out to the radio station I was working at. And I just couldn't believe it. I'm like, oh my God, it's Danny Wood from New Kids on the Block. And Paul, who owned the record label, had put us in touch. And of course, I had Danny on my night show. And then after the night show, I'm like, what's your plan with this? Are you going to tour? What are you going to do? And he's like, I haven't done a single solo show at this point. And I said, well, why don't you come up and do a show for our radio station? I know the perfect venue, and of course we'll host and we'll promote it. And that's exactly what we did. He put together a 4-piece band, and they came up, and he did his very first solo show with Citrus 95.3. And then we became fast friends. We really did. We had a lot in common. We both liked to joke, and, we both had a passion for the business. And Danny, of course, everybody knows the story behind New Kids and, the career that they have had at that, up to that point. And so I'll never forget this, Abby. And again, something I don't think I've ever talked about. I had this family, again, I still have the kids. They're growing up at this point, right? I got a steady paycheck at Citrus 95.3. And he asks me if I want to go on the road with him. And I couldn't make my mind up, but I didn't tell him that, but I couldn't. It was like this internal struggle. Do I do it? Do I do it? Do I not do it? Because I got this great job now. I'm the assistant program director. I'm on the air, got that check. I'm doing what I want to do for a living. And this was, again, at the time that, you could fax things in and out. And I couldn't make my mind up. But Danny assumed I had accepted the job. The tour was starting. In fact, the first date was in upstate New York. And the tour bus was coming from Miami to pick me up. At a rest stop in Tampa. And the night before, true story, the night before, around 11 o'clock at night, I faxed my resignation into the radio station.
And you were getting on a bus the next morning?
Yeah, like 4 or 5 in the morning. My dad dropped me off at the rest area. I didn't consult my wife at the time. The only person I always consulted was my dad. And my dad, thank God for my stepdad, who basically said, you know what? You have to follow your heart. You got to take, he used to always say, without risks, there's no reward. He was a firm believer. He still is in hard work, good work ethic, but he's like, you got to go for it. And so I got on that bus and I was petrified because I didn't know how to be a tour manager. I mean, again, it was like how I jumped into radio. I was telling you, sorry, I just jumped. I was thrust into it. I was thrust into this. Literally, we were driving to New York and he's like, okay, make sure you advance the show. I didn't even know what that meant. What does it mean to advance a show?
And you can't just Google it. You don't have a smartphone.
No, there's none of this. Yeah, so I called the venue and told them, obviously what we were traveling with and what we would need. I was like interviewing all the band members to find out what their needs were, and it came quite quickly to me. Because I was a recording artist. I did perform. I knew some of that stuff, but not to the tone of now being in charge of a high-profile artist like Danny Wood. I mean, it just
and not
crazy.
Just Danny. You're in charge of the whole band and everyone getting where they need to be on time.
Oh my gosh, I'm making hotel reservations and flights if you need them, and routing, and oh my goodness, I'm working with a booking agent, a record label. I mean, it was, man, I tell you what, a trial by fire. But man, oh man, the stories. I mean, the stories started right away. I mean, I was indoctrinated right away on that tour bus. I was like, this just wide-eyed young guy, and right away now, and you're in that world of. They always call it sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but I'm grateful that I never had to deal with the drugs part. The wildest that bus got is they wanted to watch like The Godfather over and over, or Goodfellas or something. I mean, they would partake in a couple of cocktails, but I didn't have like something wild like Gene Simmons of Kiss,
I feel like you got kind of lucky because had you caught Danny and New Kids like 10 years prior, you would have been in the throes of it.
Oh my goodness. And what's funny is the Blockheads, though, those fans are so passionate, and they just, they were so amazing to me right out of the gate. They really were. They, made me feel right at home. And I mean, they do that to this day. I'm still friends with a lot of those fans. They were there for Danny from day one. This was new to Danny too, because again, it wasn't 4 other guys on stage. It was just Danny. It was him by himself, for better or worse, and then we, right away, we toured the entire country. He released his first single. The album came out shortly after. And what was funny is the album started to make noise in Germany, of all places. So we put the U.S. we put the U.S. on hold, and now all of a sudden I'm traveling internationally to go film music videos in Germany, and we're doing stadiums in Germany, because at the time when we were doing the tour here in the States, it was like nightclubs and small theaters and things like that. But in Germany, you go and play these massive like amphitheater type shows, and you'd be on a bill with the Spice Girls. And at the time, Michelle Branch and Kelly Clarkson had just won American Idol. I'll never forget my first trip to Berlin with Danny. We did this big show with all these artists and bands that were popular in Germany and across Europe that the States hadn't heard of. But, you know, bands like the Spice Girls and Michelle Branch, I was familiar with. And then Kelly Clarkson, who had just won Idol, she had just released a single over there called Miss Independent. And we checked into the hotel. Abby, you'll love this. My first trip to Germany, and I'm in this hotel. It's right outside Berlin. I don't know Kelly Clarkson. I was on the road at the time Idol had kicked off, so I wasn't really familiar with her. And Danny's going to be embarrassed. Hopefully the blockheads don't share this with the new kid. I've never told this story. He rings my room and he says, "Hey, who's that girl outside your room?" I said, I said, "I haven't been outside my room." He said, "Well, you got to go see this girl." So I said, "I'll call you back." I go outside my room, and there's this pretty girl being interviewed, sometimes in hotels, each floor will have kind of like a little lobby area that has a couple of chairs and whatnot when you come off the elevator. It was Kelly Clarkson being interviewed by I don't know if it was like a German magazine or radio station or what it was, but she was being interviewed. So I pretended to walk to the gym and be nosy. And so then I walked back out, but then I just sat down and I listened to the interview, and this lady walks over and sits next to me, and it was her manager. And man, I'm 47, so my mind just goes sometimes, Abby, but her manager stayed her manager forever. And then she went on to manage Carrie Underwood. And I just really wish I could give her credit because she was so kind. I know it'll come to me. But anyway, I asked her, I said, "Who is that?" And she told me who it was. She says, "Well, she's almost done. I'll introduce you to her when the interview's done." So I meet Kelly. She introduces me to Kelly. And then Kelly finds out I'm working with Danny, and she grew up a New Kids fan.
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh.
Wants me to bring Danny to her room to meet her. So I go back to the room. I called Danny. I said, "You'll never believe this. This girl you're inquiring about grew up a New Kids fan." I told him who she was, that she just won American Idol. She's on the show with us. And we went to her room, and as she was getting all glammed up, we got to know her. We just hung out and visited, and then we hung out with Kelly and Michelle Branch the entire time because we were the only Americans on the show at the time. So it was just, we kind of just clung together,
My 11-year-old self is freaking out right now.
I send you the picture of me meeting Kelly. First off, I looked ridiculous because I was, super skinny. And I had what do they call them? Highlights. What were they called?
Frosted tips.
Frosted tips. And I had both ears double pierced, Abby. Oh, yeah.
It was the early 2000s. You were hot.
I thought I was, at least.
That is so nuts.
It was so much fun. We shot, when we were in Germany, we shot 2 music videos there. So that was my first experience in that. And then, things just kept growing from there with Danny. And we came back. We toured the States again. And then Jordan Knight came calling. Jordan had a great first record with Interscope, had a top 10 single with Give It To You. He was touring with NSYNC at the time. And then Interscope kind of changed their focus. You'll remember this time when Interscope really started to focus on hip hop. So that's when they signed like Eminem and 50 Cent. And those were the priorities. And the pop guys weren't so much the priorities. So Jordan had this second record recorded that they had shelved, and it had some awesome songs on it. He went to Minneapolis, which isn't too far from you, and recorded with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who did all of Usher stuff and Janet Jackson stuff. He worked with them. He worked with a unknown at the time, Robin Thicke, who had written and produced some amazing songs on this album. And this album was just sitting there doing nothing. I was able to work with him and get him back out touring again just because he wasn't doing anything. I just started to book shows with him. But Jordan was different from Danny because Jordan didn't have a band, So I said to Jordan, well, actually, Jordan said to me, because a lot of people don't realize that Jordan at the time too, and I think he still does. We all do. We all have anxiety in this business, whether you're in radio or music or whatever. We're kind of all anxious people. And he just didn't want to be on the stage by himself. Jordan, even as a solo artist, had 5 or 6 dancers and a DJ. He didn't make it on the stage. He's like, "I know you DJ, and I know you rapped, and why don't you just come on stage and be my hype man and my DJ?" And me, I was like, "Of course." And I knew
Say less.
all the New Kids catalog. Obviously, I grew up a New Kids fan. And so, yeah, we just started to get back out on the road, and we were doing the same thing that I did. It was like following in the same footsteps as Danny. We were doing small clubs and small theaters and House of Blues shows. And Jordan had a little bit bigger of a name because he did establish himself as a solo artist, and he kind of was the front man of New Kids on the Block. So we were doing a little bit bigger shows. And I brought him to the same label that Danny was working with at the time, Empire Music Works there in Miami. And we recorded a New Kids on the Block cover album. He covered himself, believe it or not. And then that led to us crossing paths with Lou Pearlman, who famously, or I should say, is infamous for some people because it's good and bad, right? The stories behind the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and LFO and all that stuff. But anyway, we ended up at Transcontinental, and Lou signed Jordan to a solo album deal there. My life just changed so much at that point because now not only am I managing him, and I'm still managing Danny, but I'm now writing with Jordan, which I'd never done with Danny. I'm writing now on Jordan's solo albums. I'm in the studio working with him, which I hadn't done with Danny before. So now it's almost like a full circle moment because now that part of me that always wanted to be a recording artist is kind of finally happening in a way because I was able to have that be a part of that process, Even if it wasn't my name on the album, it was my name in the credits on some of the songs that we were writing. And one of the biggest highlights at the time was I got to write on what the label released as a single. And the single became a top 10 hit at Adult Contemporary Radio. And I'll never forget, there was a time when I was in Las Vegas and we were like, I just wanted to, it's kind of funny because it hit the top 30 and I'm like, man, I'm fine. If it doesn't do anything else, I can always say I had a top 30 hit. And then it went top 25 and oh my God, if it never goes anywhere else. And then it went top 20 and then top 15. And then, it just kept going. And I'll never forget being in Vegas and we were just nestled right between Boyz II Men, Cyndi Lauper, and Barry Manilow on the Adult Contemporary chart. And I ran into Barry Manilow and I was telling him the story and I said, you have had so many hits over your career. What a career you've had. Can you just give me this? And he couldn't give me it. So we stalled there. we stalled before cracking that top 10 position. But I mean, what a highlight. I mean, things with Jordan for a good 3 years of my life were just, it was adventures and just living out every dream that I'd ever had. It came true with Jordan in so many ways. It really did.
And it wouldn't have happened if you wouldn't have faxed in that resignation and got on that bus at 4 a.m.
Never would have happened had I not followed my heart and followed my dad's advice. It would never have happened.
It's just so cool that it did.
Yeah, and it could have went either way. It could have stopped right then and there. It could have stopped after that one tour with Danny, and Danny said, "You know what, this really isn't working out." And then it just, for me, it blossomed. I mean, then I met Tracy. I obviously I got divorced, and but I met Tracy, and then Tracy came on the road with me and started working with me and Jordan, and then we started picking up other clients. People started seeing what we were doing, and I was kind of working with artists that were in that, that had put out albums in the late 80s and the 90s, and then we're looking for kind of that second breath, if you will. So I met Jeff Timmons from 98 Degrees. We met at the Radio Music Awards in Vegas, and we became fast friends. And Jeff was releasing a solo record, had a record deal at the time on the same label as Jim Brickman, if you know who that is. And so Jeff started to work with me, and I started to tour with him. And then I signed PM Dawn, and they had a lot of great hits in the early 90s. Brian Abrams from Color Me Bad, the lead singer of Color Me Bad, picked up a reggae band, Morgan Heritage, somebody that was signed to Michael Bivins from New Edition, who was working with Boyz II Men at the time, and BBD and ABC, a rapper named MC Brain. So here it is, myself and Tracy, and we were just trying to manage all these different careers. That was wild. I mean, when you think about it, just trying to give every one of those artists attention as a manager, but still trying to be a performer with Jordan, and kind of went back to those days when I was DJing in the club and working radio and doing this. And I was spinning a lot of plates.
How did you manage to do all of that? I mean, I know not everyone tours at the same time and not everyone's releasing stuff at the same time, but still, that's a lot of moving parts.
It was a lot of moving parts. And, to be quite honest with you, sometimes when you take on too much, some things can get missed, or some of your artists don't get the attention that they deserve. And there were times too that there would be some friction, like Jeff would reach out and be like, "Hey, you're giving not," and again, that wasn't selfish, but he'd be like, "Listen, are you just way too busy with Jordan?" I mean, he'd have to call me on the carpet at times, and rightfully so, because, he had his solo career to worry about. And Jeff he had a great career here stateside. I mean, all by himself because small labels don't have big budgets. And Jeff was coming off some major success with 98 Degrees, but Jeff was not only recording and producing and writing his own album, but he was actually, you'll appreciate this, Abby, he would take on different personas, different names, and call radio stations as a record rep. He made up these names. I think one was Ed Furby, if I remember correctly. And he would call the radio stations across the country and work the single. And he worked the single successfully to be a top 10, all by himself.
Genius.
He would set alarms. Jeff never slept because he lived in California. So he would have to be up at like 4 a.m. in California to be making calls that would reach East Coast at 7 a.m. And he would start on the East Coast and work his way across the country. And so he was like doing that here stateside, but then in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, where boy bands are just gods, he also got a solo deal there. So we had to travel over there. I mean, one thing as we're talking, I'm thinking about this out loud. I recall a time, this will show you how just nuts my life was. I had to fly to Southeast Asia with Jeff to do the promotion for his solo album there, right? And nobody works harder than Jeff Timmons. I've never met a human being that can outwork Jeff. That man, I don't know what he does to do it because he looks amazing, but I've never seen a guy that doesn't sleep, that just works 24/7. Jeff does it. But we went and we just worked our rear ends off for it was like a week straight. And we were doing radio promotion, TV, mall signings, concerts from sun up to sundown, repeat, sun up to sundown. We were in Taiwan and the Philippines and Malaysia and Brunei and all these places, Singapore. And then I flew back with Jeff, and we didn't know at the time we did all this promotion, but the album wasn't coming out until that following week,
Okay.
how well that was going to pay off from all that promotion. But I remember flying back. So I flew from Southeast Asia to California, dropped Jeff off, got back on a plane at LAX, flew to Tampa, got home. Tracy packed my bag for me. And the next morning I flew from Tampa to Boston to pick up Jordan for us to fly to the UK to do a tour of the UK with Jordan and he was doing a reality show over there at the time as well. So that was my life. It was bananas. And I'm in the UK getting a call from Jeff to let us know that his album debuted at number 1 ahead of the Backstreet Boys and Mariah Carey at the time.
Oh my gosh.
Nothing to do with me. It had all to do with Jeff and that hustle that Jeff has, that he still has today. I was so proud of him and, blown away because I think if I remember right, the album that he debuted at number 1 and beat was Mariah's Emancipation of Mimi, which was a massive album. And I think the Backstreet Boys album was Never Gone. I think, again, I'd have to look. My memory isn't that great, but it was one of the bigger Backstreet Boys albums. And even though it only stayed at number 1 for the week, what a vindication for a guy that they were saying, hey, he was in 98 Degrees. He was one of 4. Jeff, I learned so much from Jeff. I don't even know where to start. I mean, my dad and Jeff Timmons are probably 2 of the best examples of impeccable work ethic, loyalty, honesty, integrity. Those 2 guys for me.
Complete package.
Complete package. And I never met an individual like that again until my father-in-law. And to this day, Jeff and I are as thick as thieves, and Jeff is still bringing me work. We just, shot a couple of movies together, and randomly Jeff will call me out of the blue. He brought me into a project in Japan back in 2021 that I worked 9 months with, and he's a great friend.
That's so cool.
It's amazing. It's just, but again, it's funny how I look at what an awesome time in my life that was. And then Tracy got pregnant with Macy. And I think we both realized I didn't want to make the same mistakes personally that I made the first time around with my older kids. That if they were playing sports, I might catch 1 game or 2 games. Or if they had something going on at school, I might miss it all completely because I was traveling so much, And so fate kind of intervened. At the time that Tracy was getting ready to deliver, I'll never forget, we were on tour in Canada, and the doctor told Tracy she shouldn't be on this tour. She was getting ready to deliver. This was in January. Who the hell wants to tour Canada in January?
No one.
We tour bus going across Canada, and you imagine how cold that. You grew up in Minnesota, which is just stone's throw, and yeah, we were. She was like out to here pregnant, and I mean, we were on this tour bus, and she was like 3 or 4 months away from delivering, but she wanted to be on that tour, and things were changing. I think for us, things were changing for Jordan. He had some personal things that he needed to deal with, and some things that he wanted to go work on, if you will. And so after that Canadian tour, Jordan was shooting a reality show in Las Vegas, the Surreal Life Fame Games. We're in Las Vegas, and he just kind of has that moment where he's like, you know what? I got to go home. I got to work on some things. I just want to kind of get in the right headspace and just get myself healthy. And so that's what he did. And that kind of put a halt for me financially, because of all my clients at the time too, Jordan was the busiest. And that's, when you're a manager and you're working on commission, and when your top tier artist says, I need to go home and I got to work on myself and take a break. Well, that hits home for me. And I've got another child on the way. Plus I've got to support my other children. And so it was very scary. It was one of those moments where I didn't know what I was going to do again. I was kind of at that crossroads. Danny got off the road. He wanted to stay home and be more of a dad. And again, these guys can afford to, they've millionaires, and Jordan was back home doing his thing. And Jeff had taken a break too. He was working on some things. He was going through a divorce at the time, and, trying to be a dad. And he was a fantastic father, and he wanted to focus and do that. And the reggae band, they had taken so everything it's like a domino, like within that April, right before Macy was born. It was like, I remember when she was born and delivered, I didn't know really what I was going to do, because the night before she was born, I was doing my last show with Jordan. And Jeff was out there too. We were doing this big concert in Boston, Massachusetts, big fundraiser that Aerosmith was headlining. All these massive Boston bands. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to meet Steven Tyler, And I knew that Jordan was going to take a break at this time, and so I wouldn't be performing anymore. And for a while, at the time, I really didn't know that it was going to be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
I just land. I check into my hotel. I've got all this swag in my hotel, like awesome swag, zip ups, and I'm trying on hoodies, and I'm just so excited. And all my clients are doing this show too. I mean, every client that I was working with at the time was doing this show. And I get this call from Tracy, and she had, when she dropped me off at the airport, she slipped on some spilled milk in a convenience store and landed on her belly.
Oh, no.
And the doctor sent her to the hospital. And then the hospital, they said, you're in labor. And it was early. And I'm thinking, I've got every client that I work with here in Boston. And now my wife is calling, and I got to try to get home because she's going to deliver. And there were no flights to be had. None. So I thought I was going to be just on a speakerphone hearing Macy be born. I was able to catch a flight the next morning. I had to leave all my clients in Boston. Obviously, they understood. And I get to Tracy finally, and I get there, and by the way, let me put the caveat in that I talked to the doctor several times, and he said, yes, she's going to deliver. So I kept saying, are you sure? You're sure? I get there, and he goes, well, you know what? I think it was kind of a false labor. And I'm like, and I'm furious. Pissed would be a better word. So my dad says, listen, I got to calm you down. I haven't eaten nothing. He said, let me just take you to grab something to eat. The doctor, I think, was like really worried about me. So as I leave with my dad to go eat, he broke Tracy's water. I think he thought that I better make sure there's a baby, or this guy is going to come unglued.
He's going to perform a C-section if I don't.
So Macy came, and I got that news, as I shared earlier, that everybody was kind of, and I knew it, the writing was on the wall. We had kind of had conversations. And that's when, I decided I was going to step back into radio. I loved radio, had a passion for it, kept me in the music business still. And then we decided we really didn't want to raise mate. Florida was a fantastic place for us to be as a couple. We had a beautiful house. It was like everything you could think of in Florida. We had a pool, screened in Lanai. It was like the dream, right? But it wasn't a great place to raise kids. And so I ended up coming back to Iowa and landing a job back in Iowa. And that's when I got back into radio. And I don't know, within a year, I was programming again. And so I was programming and back on the air. I was doing morning drive and was doing that in Iowa. And then 6 years later, I got the call up to St. Cloud, which I don't know if I ever told you the story. That wasn't my first time in St. Cloud. Did I ever tell you that story?
No.
You ever have those deja vu moments?
All the time.
Like, I know I've met this person, or I know I've been there. And when you're touring and traveling, and I keep everything, Abby. I've kept every plane ticket. You should see my scrapbooks. I think I do a really great job with keeping everything. But I just, for some reason, it just escaped me that I had performed for KCLD's like Second Chance Prom with Jordan.
No way.
We were late because our flights were delayed. Something happened where we didn't get into Minneapolis. The event had already started, and we just finally landed in Minneapolis. So, yeah. And I think JJ had worked there at the time, JJ Halliday. And, yeah. But all of a sudden, I'm passing this theater, the Paramount, and I'm like, I've been to this theater. And then it just clicked. I'm like, I played here.
I was here.
And, I loved my time in St. Cloud. I loved working for Town Square Media. One of the most talented bunch of people. to this day, I still haven't been able to recreate that chemistry of not only the on-air staff, the programming staff, but the sales staff, the administrative staff, our engineer. Everybody was so cohesive. I tell the story and I think they think I'm lying. I was like, we were on a roll for 5 years where we did not miss one monthly budget, not one. And it's because everybody worked so well together. Everybody championed everybody. If somebody was falling short, you were there to pick them up or brainstorm, or, David could send out an email and the gal working the front desk knew where we were in the month and where we needed to be to make the month. And everybody just wanted to make sure that we met those goals. We didn't want to see the streak die. And they're just amazing human beings there. I mean, they really are. Obviously, you know how I feel about you, how much I love you, and how talented I think you are. And just, I can't say enough things about you. And I'm not just saying this on your podcast. I tell anybody that will listen. You are just one of the most wonderful human beings inside and out. You really are. And super talented. I don't even think you know how talented you are. I really don't think you know that, but you are. And it's just, I look at people like you and Ashley and one of my favorite human beings, Kelly Cords, and just an awesome crew that we had not only on Mix, but on the country station and classic rock station and WJON, and just, again, across the sports station. It just, I get kind of teary-eyed, as you can see, because I miss you guys so much. And I miss not only the radio station, but I miss that community. That is such a Central Minnesota is just a wonderful place. You know that. You were born and raised there, and just amazing people and listeners that I still keep in touch with today. And sometimes I'll be talking to Tracy and I'll be like, gosh, I really hope I made the right decision. But, coming here to Des Moines was bittersweet, because I didn't leave because I had to leave. Sometimes in our business, you're forced out. I left for no other reason, but I wanted Tracy to be home because her father had passed away, and I wanted her to be able to be by her mom and by her siblings. And, I wanted Macy to be around family. And it was like the perfect storm, because Macy had just wrapped up elementary school. So if we were going to make the change, it was like, this is the time to make the change. You're going into middle school, and, so it all worked out well. But I got to tell you, I think making that decision to move here was harder than the facts that I had to do when I was making the decision to go on the road. It really was, because I loved all of you so much. And I was so happy that was a really tough decision. And sending that email to David, my heart sunk. I mean, when people say that, my heart sunk. I was physically ill after sending that email, and I had to send it to him when he was on vacation, of all things.
Oh, brutal.
I wasn't able to talk to him in person because I had to do it, because the company I was going to work for, Cumulus Media, they wanted to put the announcement in the trades, and I didn't want to come out in the trades, obviously, without giving a proper notice. And I told Cumulus, I'm like, I have to give at least a 30-day notice. And they understood, because of the job being the operations manager and the PD. And there was just too many things that needed to be put in place. I wanted to leave the station the right way. I wanted to leave it in the right hands. And I was so grateful that I was not only left in the right hands, but all of you at Mix stepped up. I mean, like Ashley stepped into that PD role, and all that gave me peace of mind in some, weird way. It did, even though I just missed it. And, now we're talking my 6th-year anniversary coming up in August here.
Has it been 6 years? Oh, my gosh.
6 years. And, it's funny. I went back. It's funny. I thought for a while that part of my life of being on the road and working with those guys was over. We continued the friendships whenever the new kids would tour. Obviously, I would go see them and spend time with them. Jeff would come and tour. I would see Jeff, and, a string of artists that I'd worked with, obviously. But a call came in 2015 from Danny asking what I thought about going back out on the road again. And it was interesting, because he was going back out on the road to raise money for his charity that he founded in his mom's name, to raise money for breast cancer. And he was recording another solo album. And he said, hey, I'm just going to do the weekend warrior thing. I'm still a dad. Had a lot going on. Obviously, at that time, too, the new kids they were touring arena still. So he made me a proposition that said, hey, if you and Tracy come back out on the road, we'll just do Friday, Saturday, Sunday dates. And God bless David Engberg. I've never said this to him, but I want to thank him on this podcast for allowing me the opportunity to revisit that part of my life again. And we did 30 dates around the country, Tracy and I. And I also want to thank my mother-in-law, because she came up and took care of Macy Lynn for us while we were able to go out and live that part of my life again. And the funny story behind that is my first event with Danny was on my 40th birthday, January 13th, 2006. No, pardon me, 2016, Jesus.
Don't date
2016.
yourself like that.
2016, we were on the set of the Today Show, and Danny was performing, and we were there with Brooke Shields and Ice Cube and Kevin Hart. So I was watching Danny get makeup on, shooting the breeze with Brooke Shields. It's crazy. And then we were just, every weekend we were out. We'd fly into like Pittsburgh and do dates around Pennsylvania. The next weekend we would fly into New York and do New York and Boston, and so on and so forth. And so I got to relive that again. And Danny and I always joke that it happened again. He's like, I think he's got the bug to do some more solo stuff. The cool thing about the new kids is they allow themselves the opportunity to do other things. They plan these arena tours and these cruises, in between their other solo endeavors or business endeavors. Donnie Wahlberg, as we all know, is just on everything and everything. So I love that they allow themselves that freedom and that respect. And so that was fun.
You have just had the wildest life, and that's why I wanted you to be on this podcast, because I've heard my fair share of stories, but I knew there were more that I hadn't heard, and most of them today were ones that I hadn't heard.
Well, it's funny, and I think, if there's a lesson to be learned, it's that you don't burn a bridge. You keep the people that you love and respect close. I cherish those friendships and those relationships. And like I said, Jeff has, not just Danny, but Jeff has brought me so many fun, amazing opportunities. I never thought in a million years I'd be in movies and doing even though they were small roles in like straight to streaming movies, it was something I never thought in a million years was on my radar. But thanks to Jeff Timmons and him introducing me to Candace Cain, and I got to be in a movie called Baking Up Love and Killer Holiday. And then I got to do something for Apple TV. And yeah, again, all thanks to those same folks that gave me those opportunities initially. And I was just thinking back on somebody I toured with. My first tour of all when I did all of Europe, right? The first time I went to Europe was thanks to somebody you might know, because again, you're in radio, and I'm sure some people listening to this podcast, she was very, very famous in the 80s. Her name was Irene Cara, and her big number one was Flashdance, What a Feeling. She was also at a song called Fame from the TV show Fame. And she brought me to Europe for the first time. And that was right when I met Danny, but he wasn't really doing dates at the time. And she's like, hey, you want to go? And she lived by me in Florida. So yeah, and she passed away recently. And I got this message from her publicist about being a part of her public memorial that's coming up this fall. And I thought, what a touching thing. I was only worked with her briefly, but again, she was a big part of my story and why I got to do what I did. So I'm grateful. I think if anything, I just want everybody to know how grateful. When I look back, like I said, I'm 47. I'm grateful for every opportunity, good and bad.
Well, and I'm grateful for you, because you're just an incredible human, and you're just so great at connecting people to other cool people that then in turn changes their life and makes their life better. And I just think that's a real gift, and it's a gift that you have that you get to give to others.
Well, the gift is being on this podcast. It really was. It was fun to walk down I'm almost teary-eyed because I haven't thought about a lot of this stuff in a long time. And I try at my old age to tell the people that I love and I appreciate, that I do and love and appreciate them. I had this long conversation with my stepdad, who I call my dad, because I don't have a relationship with my biological dad. I never did, but I had this call with him. He was sick, and this was over the pandemic. You'll appreciate this because you're close to your parents. And I always tell my parents that I love them. And I'm sure you do too.
Every phone call.
Yeah, I love you. But it's I love you. Talk to you tomorrow. During the pandemic, I was worried. My dad's getting up there. My dad will be 79 in June, but he's a young 79, still works part-time. And my mom would call me over the pandemic. This was like, I don't know, about a year or so ago. The pandemic was kind of still going a little bit, And she said, oh, your dad's just not feeling well. He actually came home from work. And that was weird because, like I told you, my dad's work ethic, never called in sick, never came home sick. And to hear he came home sick, right? And I was thinking about him all night, like, God, I hope he's all right, And one thing that I've really reconnected with over the last several years is my faith. I'm really in touch with my faith. And I read a daily devotional. And so I was thinking about my dad all night. And the next morning, I was restless. I didn't sleep really good. Next morning, I opened up my devotional. The title of this devotional is Your Dad's Voice. I know, right?
What?
I know. It's all about your dad and how important your dad is in your life and et cetera, right? I'm bawling. I can't get through this devotional, right? And me and my dad, we have such a wonderful relationship. We joke together. My dad has toured with me and traveled with me. Like he went out with me with Jordan just because he wanted to see. He's been involved in every aspect of my life, you know. So I call him because I want to express to him just how much he means to me. And he answers the phone, and like I told you, my dad's very bubbly. He's up, never sick. And he answers the phone, and immediately when I hear his voice, it sounds shallow. I immediately start crying, and I've never cried to my dad. And he thought I was calling him to tell him some bad news. He's like, what's wrong? He thought maybe something was wrong with Tracy.
Yeah, he's going, who died?
Yeah. And I told him this whole story I just told you. And then I just went into a 45-minute call of just expressing to him just how much he meant to me. From when he took over that dad role when I was in 5th grade to being such an amazing role model and a great dad and grandfather. I mean, and between this, I'm crying and saying I couldn't imagine if anything ever happened to you, because I knew he was sick, and believe me, I know this is dramatic, but it goes back to what I was telling you. I just want not just people like Danny Wood and Jordan Knight and Jeff Timmons and all the people that I worked with, and people like David Engberg and Marty Spies at Community First Broadcasting, and my current boss, Jack Taddeo at Cumulus. I just want everybody to know, my children, my mom and dad, my friends and family, people like you, how much I love you and appreciate you, because you don't know if you're going to get that opportunity. And I don't want things left unsaid. So that's kind of my mission, if you will.
Well, I love and appreciate you too.
So, and thank you for allowing me this outlet. This has been, I'm usually on the other end doing the interview, and this was so much fun.
It's kind of fun to be on the opposite side of things, isn't it?
It means so much. I'm grateful that you reached out to do this.
I'm so glad that you were willing to do it.
Thanks for letting me walk down memory lane. And I know that your next guest is somebody I love and appreciate very much, a good friend of mine, Justin Plouffe.
And it's all because of you. I wouldn't have him on my podcast and have him as a friend if it wasn't for you. So
he is I said Jeff is one of the hardest working people. I would put Justin Plouffe and his entire family and that entire band, Mason Dixon Line, Throwbacks, I would put them in that same category of just wonderful, amazing human beings and sickly talented.
Yes.
Sickly talented. Is that a word? Sickly talented?
We'll make it one.
Well, I'm so thrilled for your new job.
Thanks.
And your great marriage right now and your family. And so I just hope everybody continues to be well, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your spring and summer. So
you too. Before you totally bail on me here, where can people find you online if they want to follow all of your adventures?
I'm easy to find. Chad Taylor Radio. Everything is at Chad Taylor Radio. I would love to say hello, so connect with me, please.
Thank you for tuning in to the Small Town Tourist Podcast. I'm your host, Abby Graves. Our theme song is Queen of Our Hometown by Rachel McIntyre Smith. You can stream it wherever you listen to music. And be sure you follow Rachel at Rachel McIntyre Smith on all social media platforms. You can find her online too at rachelmcintyresmith.com. You can find the Small Town Tourist online at the Small Town Tourist on Instagram and Facebook. And of course, on our blog, thesmalltowntourist.com. Please leave a rating and review of this podcast, and we'll catch you back here next week for another episode.